Great. Okay, well, thank you for finding your chat box. Let's go ahead and get started. We'd like to welcome you to the IRDL Scholars Speaker Series. The series is coordinated by a working group of librarian researchers who participated in a professional continuing education program called the Institute for Research Design in Librarianship. We welcome you today from the William H. Hannon Library at Loyola Marymount University, the home of IRDL. My name is Marie Kennedy. I'm the Serials and Electronic Resources Librarian and the co-director of IRDL. Welcoming you also is Christine Brancolini, co-director of IRDL and Dean of the Library. So this series is designed to shine a spotlight on voices and ideas that challenge the traditional ways of conducting research. It examines specific research methods and critiques of processes associated with Western social science approaches, with the intention of inspiring research explicitly rooted in social justice. As librarians, educators, and researchers, we welcome this opportunity to reflect and incorporate what we learned from today's session into our own research efforts so that our methodologies integrate anti-racist and anti-colonial practices. So we look forward to thinking critically about research and power with you at today's session with Sara McClelland. Two IRDL scholars will be your moderators for today, Letha Miles Edmondson and Sophie Rondeau. Take it away, Letha and Sophie.
My name is Letha Miles Edmondson. I work as a research and instructional services librarian at Marquette University. Marquette is located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I live and work on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of the Michigami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, the Menominee, and the Kinnickinnick rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We are mindful of our responsibility to practice good relations with the land and water as elders and ancestors, past and present and emerging, have done.
My name is Sophie Rondeau, and I am the Assessment and E-Resources Program Analyst with VIVA, and we are Virginia's Academic Library Consortium. As an organization that spans the Commonwealth, we recognize the many nations that are traditional custodians of this expanse, including the Cherowanhaka, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Patawomic, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock, and other currently unrecognized tribes as the original inhabitants of Virginia. We honor their continued connection to the land. We also recognize the limitations of land acknowledgement statements and that there are specific things that we can do as librarians toward decolonization. If we are committed to anti-racist practices and research approaches, we can take care to acknowledge settler colonialism, white supremacy, and displacement. We encourage you to engage more personally by researching the different lands we currently inhabit, and would like to highlight a few Indigenous land organizations so that you can educate yourselves through Native and Indigenous perspectives and help you find organizations that you may want to build relationships with based on where you live. Please make use of the URLs, which we will post in the chat for you to explore. We also encourage you to consider these two questions. Question 1. What does a land acknowledgement mean to me personally? And question 2, how am I dismantling settler colonial structures beyond this land acknowledgement? And these questions are from a guide to land acknowledgements at Western University. And now a little bit about how today will run. We are recording this session and it will be made publicly available on LMU Library's YouTube channel soon. We will be using the live transcription provided by Zoom. The Q&A as well as chat have been enabled. Please use the Q&A to direct questions to the speaker and use the chat for commenting and sharing your thoughts with the group. In the spirit of this series, addressing issues of power and research, we are using a progressive stacking approach to the Q&A and will prioritize questions from BIPOC and other marginalized attendees. Please use an asterisk at the front of your question to self-identify. We want this to be an uplifting and positive discussion. It is a professional event, and we will not tolerate any disrespectful comments in this session. We reserve the right to remove anyone from today's session if we observe anything that does not honor our speaker or fellow attendees. Our plan for this event is to invite our speaker, Dr. Sara McClelland, to speak for about 45 minutes. And then we will have approximately 15 minutes for questions and answers. And after that, we will have about 30 minutes to talk about practical applications within library and information science. We will save time for questions and answers at the end. So thank you for your attention. Letha will now introduce you to our speaker for the day.
Thank you, Sophie. Dr. Sara McClelland is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Michigan. She is a feminist psychologist who studies stigma and discrimination with a focus on issues of reproductive justice and critical sexuality studies. Her research focuses on developing social science methods and designs with the potential to impact medicine, education, and public policy. This has included studying the role of racism in assessing abortion attitudes, the effects of abstinence only until marriage, sex education on young adults, and gaps in clinical care for women diagnosed with cancer. More details about her research and publications can be found at progresslab.info. Sara McClelland's talk today is titled, "In the Fabric of Our Methods, Examining the Role of Racist and Sexist Stereotypes in Survey Research." Please join me in welcoming Sara.
Thank you, everyone, for that really lovely introduction and a way for all of us to think together. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. And I think I speak for all of my colleagues who think librarians are amongst the most important colleagues we have. So I could not be more thrilled to be in conversation with librarians who are thinking about issues of social justice, issues of research methods. These feel like such important questions, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this conversation. So with that, I will begin the process of sharing my screen and launch in. So you can see from the title, I'm going to be thinking with you today about what I'm calling the fabric of methods. And one of the ways that I've really thought about this is going to be woven throughout several studies that I've done. And so this is a way to sort of help make what I developed initially theoretically into more kind of thinking about how to work critical ideas that we might think theoretically into critical methods. How might we do research with these big important theories in mind? So that's what we're going to be thinking about today. And I wanted to begin by actually starting with what my own disciplinary investments are, because I think that's a way for researchers to communicate with each other and also to communicate the priorities that we have as researchers. So I come to you with four that I think are important for the talk today. One is psychology. I'm trained as a psychologist, and I'm trained actually in social personality psychology, just for those that might be interested. But what's important, I think, about how I draw on psychology is that psychology thinks about this word of construal. In other words, how do we think about, how do we imagine both ourselves and others? But in particular, how do people imagine those that are imagined as outgroups? What's the role of stereotype, schemas, and stigma? Those are actually all central psychological questions. But even more so, as you heard in Letha's introduction of me, I identify as a feminist psychologist. And there, feminist psychology has made great roads in the last few decades into thinking both about critical methods, which is what I'm going to talk about today, but also studies of unequal treatment that result from attributions of worth, value, and status to some and not all, but really thinking about how feminist psychology can then think with how then that happens, the patterns of unequal treatment, the patterns of how people make attributions. And then turning to the third, what's known as STS, or Science and Technology Studies, is studying the production of science and knowledge claims. How do we make science? How do we make research? What are knowledge claims and how do they come to be made? And then lastly, really turning towards feminist theory, and particularly the really important work done by Black feminists in terms of reproductive justice. And then what I'm going to be turning to in terms of feminist theories that I'm developing, which is the role of sexism in public policies, which is a body of work that I'm working on that I'll be talking about today. So with that kind of in mind, in terms of thinking about how researchers position themselves and the kinds of theories that they draw on, let me turn towards a central concept that you're going to see me return to through today, which is really the major concept that I use to orient myself as a researcher, and that's the idea of deservingness. Deservingness in terms of both what people imagine themselves as deserving, what other people imagine others as deserving, and how that then exchange both becomes part of how we think about living in the world right now. As we can see, deservingness is a really crucial way that we orient, categorize, make hierarchies, distribute resources to some, not all. So deservingness is a really crucial concept in how I orient myself and my methods. So one of the key theories that orients me as well is an idea of intimate justice that I developed back in about 15 years ago in thinking about a couple of ideas. So intimate justice is a theory, but it links experiences of inequity in the socio-political domain, so sort of our social worlds, our political worlds, with how individuals imagine and evaluate the quality of their sexual and relational experiences. So this is just a sort of small definition of this larger theory, but I want to draw out one piece. So in the argument of intimate justice, I also argue that this basic premise that experiences that differ in the socio-political domain requires researchers to take up new ideas. And that's where I say this means that researchers must, and there's two key points here, consider how people's expectations differ as a result of unequal treatment in the socio-political domain, and that we must develop critical methods that assess the context surrounding participants' responses. So you can see intimate justice sort of starts with this big kind of idea, and it then moves into the psychology of how we might then think about unequal expectations, and then even more crucially moves to, and we must then think about ourselves as researchers who are doing research within this context, and how might our methods live up to this, live up to needing to understand how people's expectations might differ, how might we capture that? So that's going to be a way that we're going to think together today. And here's just some citations. I've included citations throughout for those that might want to follow up and read in more detail. One other piece that some folks might have seen is that Peggy Orenstein in her book, Girls and Sex, that came out now, I want to say 5 years ago, really took up the question of intimate justice and used it, and Orenstein used it as a really central concept in her book. So this book got a lot of attention across the country and world. And if you want to think about or read how Peggy Orenstein uses intimate justice, you can see it's also in her TED Talk. So there's ways that this is a good example of where a theory written by an academic kind of moves into public discourse and popular books. And so this, I think, also offers us a way to see how some of these things move around. So I think there's also a central question. As I thought about speaking with librarians today, I really also wanted to think about this question of what research is and what does it mean to measure something in research. This is something that some researchers think about, and it's going to be a thing I think about with you, but I wanted to give a little background. And I know that the speaker series is really thinking about different ways of assessment. So I wanted to just offer some basic questions, and you'll see we'll return to this throughout our time today. So how do researchers across different disciplines, because I know that this is a kind of crucial piece of your speaker series and your lives as those working in libraries of different sorts, right? So how do researchers think about measurement and assessment? What tools do researchers have to make these assessments, and are they any good? As in, are they useful? Are they relevant? Are they accurate? So these are some of the questions. And I'm going to move towards a specific example of how measurement happens. But this is a kind of central question of the social sciences, which is we are often asked to assess and or measure very hard to capture phenomenon. It's sometimes people's beliefs, their moods, dynamics in the world. In essence, the question that haunts social science is how do we assess things that are very hard to see or capture, unlike behaviors that are sometimes easier to understand. Psychology in particular often moves to things that are very difficult to see. So this raises questions then of how shall we assess? And then thinking about the audience here as a consumer of research or as a collaborator with other kinds of researchers or as researchers yourselves, what can you do to think about research that measures something hard to see or identify? And this, I think, is a really crucial question to make really clear, because this is hard. It's not something that's self-evident. So we have to really then examine how do we come to assess things and what are the things that we miss along the way and how might our methods then adjust to do some of that. So we're going to think about how to do this in a couple of different domains. So I want to then just start by defining this idea of what are critical research methods. This is a kind of term that I, in collaboration with other kinds of critical researchers and critical psychology, really think about. So let me do some definitions. So I've made this graphic, which are critical research methods that I work with and have developed. And over our time today, I'm going to be mentioning some of them, but I also just wanted to give you a kind of sense of some of the citations for those, again, that might want to think about these things in more depth. And in our conversation today, I'm going to talk about 3 of these critical research methods: cognitive debriefing, self-anchored ladder, and an item bank. Now, this is just, what do I have here? 5 different critical methods. There's many, many others. These are the ones that I have developed or work with in my own research. And then these citations are that bring up either some or all of these in particular studies and in publications as a way to see then how does this actually look. And just to give a little definition of then what critical research methods are, it's methods at their kind of core that continually try to draw attention to how concepts are defined and assessed by researchers, right? So it's both in the definition of maybe the thing that someone's trying to study, and then how then the assessment of that thing might happen. And I think the crucial aspect of it, it also asks how methodological decisions work to hide the reproduction of inequality. So how there might be a kind of systematicity to this kind of absences that we then reproduce in research. And just to cite a dear colleague and advisor, Michelle Fine, wrote that critical researchers work to trace the biography of our questions, which I think is a lovely way of thinking about self-reflexivity in terms of how we then might always keep a very close eye on how the priorities that we have or the assumptions we have as researchers or the experiences we draw on then create biographies of our questions, which are not the biographies of necessarily the people or phenomenon or constructs that we're trying to study. So it's a deep attention to this self-reflexivity as well. And as the word critical now floats around in our national discourse, I also wanted to highlight how I'm using the word critical. And it, along with many others, it signals a researcher's commitment to accounting for and examining the production and maintenance of inequality in research. So we might see how that shows up in places like critical race theory, in places like critical psychology or critical sexuality studies. So this is a way that researchers across domains are trying to flag to one another this kind of self-reflexive process that importantly then shifts how we then operate in our own research and the kinds of questions we might ask and the kinds of methods that we might access. So I'm going to walk through several examples, and I'm going to start with one that is the self-anchored ladder. And the self-anchored ladder has a longer history in psychology, and I've taken it up and adapted it to this new form. But I want to start with just an image that probably people have seen in their lives. It's called a Likert scale. And it ranges from, it's usually 5, 7, 9 points on a survey. I bet you've filled out a survey that has some kind of Likert scale in it. And it ranges, right? You can see this one ranges from highly dissatisfied to highly satisfied. This is the kind of thing survey researchers use all the time. How satisfied were you with this webinar? Might be a survey that you get after this webinar. So this is a kind of way that researchers are interacting with participants all the time. But we might pause here and say, yes, I've seen something like this all the time. Are there questions we might have, given all the things that I just said a few minutes ago about how we could be self-reflexive about this? For example, we might ask, what does satisfied mean? What does satisfied tell us? Did I make an appraisal within myself? Am I comparing myself to an expectation? Am I comparing myself to someone else? So you can start to see, if you just pause, there's a few questions that might emerge. And I'll give you 2 others that I think we might think about. And you can hear how I introduced myself is to see that how this shows up. What is the role of people's uneven expectations when evaluating their own experiences? In other words, if I expected a little, does that mean I'd be satisfied with a little? If I expected a lot, does that mean that I might have more opportunities for being dissatisfied? So there starts to be then comparison questions in mind. And then to sort of add a slightly more technical issue, but I think is important, what are the dimensions? We might even define those as factors or themes that a person draws on to make their evaluation, in this case, of satisfaction. So with these kind of questions, you could even be imagining other questions in your mind about how this kind of scale kind of orients a person. I want to bring you to an example that I've thought about too, which is in terms of these expectations, just so you see how I was thinking about this, right? So how far or close is an individual to their lowest or highest expectation? And just to give you a visual, we might think, right, so here's a range of one person's expectations, and here's another person's range of expectations. So what is somebody's high point might be somebody's kind of low to middle point. And this is in a kind of very hypothetical, at a distance question here, and we're going to turn to real data so that I can populate this with actual participants and how people talk about this. But I wanted to give you a visual so that you can start to see, right? So how then do our expectations compare to one another? And you might even then guess, what's the role of the socio-political experiences, the kinds of public policies someone might live in, the kinds of laws that shape who they're allowed to engage in marriage with, or the kinds of public schooling they might have had, or other kinds of ways that our lives are shaped, the kinds of resources we had access to or didn't have access to. So in terms of this, I've thought about this a lot in this aspect of satisfaction. And this is a sign that someone took for me that's on the rest, that's outside of a rest area in Texas. And what's funny about this that I like is that you can press satisfied, although I'm not sure who would ever know that you pressed it, but you can't press unsatisfied. So in terms of measurement, I always think this is a apt way of how we might think about what does it mean to actually endorse a satisfaction appraisal and an unsatisfied appraisal. So I'm also going to turn from satisfaction more broadly to a study I did about sexual satisfaction. And so sexual satisfaction is this kind of concept that researchers across several domains, but often kind of in the field of sexuality studies, ask participants all the time. And so we might then pause to think, all right, so what does it mean when somebody thinks about being sexually satisfied, right? Is it an appraisal of activities that someone enjoys? Is it the most recent experience or a long time ago? Is it the quality of my relationship? What if I'm not in a relationship? What about my partner's happiness? Is it about a specific kind of sexual experience or life, or is it about my own mood? So these kinds of things, where you can just see I've mapped a few of them here on this slide, allow us to think like, right, these are the kinds of, in psychology, we call these sometimes dimensions, but you can start to see there's a lot of things happening here, right? A kind of layering. And as a researcher, we want to then think, so what am I getting when someone answers about their sexual satisfaction? Lots of different components, lots of layered phenomenon. So with that in mind, there might be something for us to think about how to measure this concept. So I just have the citation of where I describe this study and the kind of questions in it more broadly here. You can see the citation, but you can also see that I'm starting to move visually towards, okay, so what does it mean to have low, midpoint, and high satisfaction? So here's what this looks like. And this is my kind of adaptation of what's known as a self-anchored ladder. And you can see there's two components of it here. This 10-point ladder, so I've expanded it rather than the 5 that we saw a few minutes ago. I've expanded it to 10 points, and there's no anchors, right? There's nothing that says highly dissatisfied or highly satisfied like we saw in the other. So there's no anchors on this ladder, and that's the horizontal thing with the vertical lines. But then below it, so that's a quantitative measure, I should say, right? How would you rate it? And with no markings, you can see that someone is still being instructed to go from low to high, left to right in terms of the ladder organization. But they're asked to sort of appraise it on this blank ladder. So they put an X somewhere on this ladder. And then in the subsequent question, please describe what the low, middle, and high point ends of the scale mean to you. And so that's done qualitatively with a little bit of typing or a little bit of writing when I do it in paper and pencil. And so this is a method, this is a survey, this is considered sort of 2 survey items, if we think about it that way. And I put sexual satisfaction in brackets because, in fact, I use this method across lots of different studies, but I'm going to give you a little insight and data about my study about sexual satisfaction using this. So what you have is a quantitative and qualitative assessment. You also have where someone locates themselves on this without being instructed about necessarily how to think about it. So we get their own idiosyncratic definitions of how they're thinking about these issues. So this is a way of kind of taking these larger questions of what does the satisfaction assessment look like or include, and then we start to get kind of person level insight. What are they drawing on? Who are they comparing themselves to? What's important? What's less important? So this kind of allows us to think more carefully about the assessment. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of a taste of a few participants so you see what this looks like in action. So here's a first, and this was done with young people, and they were 18 to 24 in this particular study. So we're going to look at one example, so a man, 20 years old, white, and identifies as heterosexual. And on this ladder, he gave himself a 7. So we see something just about where he placed himself on this ladder. And then let's turn towards how we define the low, middle, and end. So his low end is not having sex. So it's the absence of a certain kind of behavior. His high point, the best sex I've ever experienced. So fair enough, he's a young man. He has years of life ahead of him. So he's put himself at a 7 because his high point, his future imagined self, has more room to grow, more ahead, right? So this you can interpret sort of along these ways. And we might then say, okay, so that we can see sort of his range, that he's the imagined range he has to his to making his assessment here. So let's look at somebody else. So here, a woman, 18-year-old, white, who identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, LGB, places herself in a different moment of the ladder, 8.5, a little higher. So we might, if we just thought about the quantitative assessments, we would compare these two people perhaps as saying, well, she has higher sexual satisfaction than her male peer who appeared in the last example. But let's look then at how she defines this. Her low point, my partner wasn't satisfied. We did something I was uncomfortable with. It was painful. We didn't cuddle afterwards. So here you start to see a couple of key factors playing into her evaluation: the role of another person, the role of discomfort and pain, and the role of affection. as part of what's important to her in making this evaluation. And then we see her high point, what she's comparing herself to in terms of locating this 8.5. We're both satisfied. We both have orgasms. It was spontaneous. It was passionate. So we can see these factors, these dimensions she's drawing on. So this, her 8.5, we could and should situate differently than her 20-year-old male peer in the previous example. While his high point was being compared to the best sex that he's ever experienced, which lays in his future, this young woman is bringing it to a current sexual relationship, in this case, thinking about partner and herself. She's thinking about specific outcomes like orgasm, and she's thinking about qualities of her current sexual life. Her 8.5 then sits quite differently. So here we can start to just see how we can play with and think about the kinds of patterns we might examine and the kinds of insights that this ladder allows us to see. So one last example so that we can see how this plays out in a third person. We have a man, 23, white, heterosexual again. So here we see a similar aspect of thinking about neither person has an orgasm or satisfied. So he's turning much like then the woman in the previous example towards himself and a partner. We see in his midpoint, only I was satisfied more than my partner. So we see somebody negotiating differently with different kinds of outcomes for each person. And both people were satisfied and neither person was left unhappy. So we have these kinds of ways that we can see someone managing some of these ways of making this very difficult evaluation. Asking somebody whether they're sexually satisfied is not an easy thing to be able to produce quickly. So we start to see how people are working through their answer. One last example of thinking then about a woman who's 18 and Latina heterosexual, we see her all the way at the end, the high point. So her evaluation is a 10, similar to her other woman peer in the other example. Wrong time, emotionally sad or depressed, sick, feels like your partner just satisfied himself, or a random person. Again, sort of looking around the context surrounding the sexual encounter. Similar, we see this role of care or attention as one of the things that she's drawing on in making her evaluation. Just did it sex like a regular daily task, like brushing teeth, so it has a kind of routineness to it or a mundaneness to it. But we also really see, importantly, as a heterosexual and in terms of naming a male partner here, the lack of birth control. So we also start to see, in terms of women who are navigating unintended pregnancies or outcomes of sexual relationships with men, the kinds of things that different people are having to account for when making their evaluations. And it was only heterosexual women who then were accounting for birth control. And this example represents another theme throughout the whole sample. So again, her 10 point, much like the other woman in the study, perfect time, healthy and safe, birth control perfect, personal closeness, feeling loved. So her 10 sits very differently, as we can see across these peers, of how she's evaluating what is sexually satisfied. So just with these 4 examples, we start to see, right, how are people making these decisions? And more importantly, even for our conversation today, how can our methods help us see all of these things happening when we ask them? I could just ask it in the quantitative way, and I would show very little difference really between these groups. There's a difference between a 7 and a 10 on this scale. And we might then even think about perhaps a gender difference. But when we take into we're starting to hone in on that there's some other elements that people draw on. And without asking, we don't know it. But however, what we get here is a pairing of the qualitative and the quantitative, right? So we can interact with what we think of as survey data that's kind of at a distance. But with some methods, you can understand something more about what people are thinking about. So to return to our idea of deservingness, I just want to bring that as a concept back to thinking about, is that might be one of the things that this kind of ladder helps us understand. How much do people think they deserve? And how are they comparing that with what they think they deserve, right? What are they comparing their kind of current outcomes, their current experiences, with how much they think they deserve? And I think this ladder, in some small way, starts to help us get to some of those questions of deservingness in an empirical way, which is very hard to get people to think about deservingness, So this would be a kind of what I would call an analytic that you might bring, a question that you might bring to these data. Can I see how deservingness is showing up in these responses? So let me turn now to a very different topic, but kind of under the same umbrella of thinking both about critical methods, but also about a very different kind of topic. So here I'm going to turn to my research on abortion and how we assess abortion attitudes. So I want to start with the basic premise of my particular study, which is the role of stereotypes as they float in the air and we all breathe in. So this is all of us breathing in the stereotypes about racism, sexism, many of the things associated with sexuality, sex, public policy, resource distribution. So if we start with that as a basic premise, we also then want to ask some questions about historical stereotypes and the distribution of these stereotypes over time. So this kind of classic example of an illustration of welfare queens and women of color taking advantage of or being recipients of public support dating back now centuries, but in particular in the last 40 years, plays a really important role, I argue, in how we think about both sexuality, reproduction, and abortion. And one need only look to 1965 and the Moynihan Report to where this was really concretized and placed into public policy as a sense of how people draw on these negative stereotypes that really link, in particular, Black women's associations with hyperfertility, poor parenting, and too many children. So this way of forming some of this research in the contemporary moment, I think it's really important to historicize. And I'm only going back to 1965. These stereotypes go, of course, centuries much further. But even if we just think about this last period of time in US history, how the Moynihan Report and very similar kinds of documents that have been produced since then inform us as researchers. And this is the self-reflexivity that I think is quite important. It's not just about a researcher looking in their heart, it's about a researcher thinking about the histories that they have been saturated with. So with that in mind, then thinking about how shall we think about how to study this, both in terms of how researchers do this work and how participants also are saturated in these histories. And it's both that we need to be thinking about in order to develop research that doesn't reproduce these. So I'm going to just, and before I move on, I just, in case this image just appeared recently, and I think is a really important, crucial articulation of how this Moynihan Report is also saturated in this, but these deep images and reproduction of this hyperfertility, poor Black women, women of color, and this kind of population explosion fears that have circulated throughout the US, again, for centuries, but even in these last 60 years. But again, we want to sort of draw on this history so that we can understand how it's being a crucial and unacknowledged part of how we're thinking about reproductive rights and reproductive justice in 2022 and beyond. So I'm going to just talk about one part of this study today. Oh, actually, I'm going to talk about both parts of the study today. One I'm going to think about as an item bank, and then next I'm going to turn to just a little bit of data collection from this study. So an item bank. An item bank asks a researcher, and I'm going to define it in 1 second, right? It's a way of thinking about bringing all the research methods together so that you can study the means of how research is happening. So an item bank is where a researcher then collects the content of items and also response options, which is like how you would answer the question, and to study the patterns of how researchers have asked questions. So this kind of I would place in an STS framework, a science technology studies framework, which is studying the making of science. So you might ask, so why study item content systematically? And there's a couple of ways that I want to offer an argument for this, which is, as you can guess, there's socially and historically meaningful cues embedded in survey research tools that it's only by examining how items have been written, what items have been most circulated through research settings, we start to see what kinds of data, what kinds of findings are developed, and importantly, what isn't asked. what is missing from our knowledge base because we have not asked some questions systematically. Again, a lot of this remains out of sight of the investigators who rely on survey items. We often think about if it's been used a lot, that makes it better. It's often called a gold standard. But we also then think that just is a circular repetition of potentially a very partial way of understanding the world. And systematic and interpretive analyses are necessary because patterns can be difficult to see. They've become normalized or they've been seen as best. And these patterns might be spread across lots of studies over long periods of time. So it might be very difficult then to assess a pattern if you're a lone investigator. So hence, this is why one of the first steps I did when starting a study on abortion attitudes was to think, how have US researchers measured abortion attitudes in the recent past? What could I gain by examining items, wording, references, imagery? And how might I then think about that both in terms of what's asked, but also in terms of the options that are given? And what are the role of racist and sexist stereotypes in this item structure and wording, which you can see is informing a lot of the kinds of questions that I ask. And again, what kind of item gaps might be identified? What's not measured? What are we overlooking? What are we refusing to ask? So as I mentioned, item bank is done basically by searching the literature systematically. So I can imagine those working as librarians, this might be something that you might very much contribute to in terms of really doing a kind of systematic collating of the research across different disciplines, different time periods. The item bank that I developed for this, I looked at 2008 to 2018, I was looking at the previous decade of research. I was looking both in representative and non-representative studies, meaning ones with very big samples that would represent the US population versus smaller studies where you might have a much smaller sample that doesn't aim to represent the whole United States. So that invites kind of big, expensive research into the item bank, as well as smaller research studies that don't have those kind of resources. I've concentrated on the US since abortion policy and nation is very tied closely, and not every country has the same abortion policies. I looked across different disciplines, but very much just thinking as one does through different kind of search terms to really get what are all the survey items that have assessed abortion attitudes in the past 10 years. So collecting all those, I then 80 studies over, again, 10 years with 456 items. And again, one of the reasons that this, you might be surprised that it's 80 studies. There's lots more studies, but some of what I wanted to do was think about unique item usage. So for example, I'll show you in a minute, some items are asked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times because the same assessment, the same measure is used. So rather than oversaturate my item bank with one particular scale, I selected them for where they might appear once so that the repetition wasn't included in the item bank. So the 80 studies are unique items in the item bank. All published research. If the items were not included in the publication, we reached out to the authors to get them. And we created an item database, again, with the item and response option, as well as some sample the details about the study, including sample, where it was done, et cetera. So this, I feel like, is for those who are really interested in kind of the specifics of data methods and thinking through these questions. So this may be for some, not all, but these are the ways that I analyze the items then. So is there specific kinds of content or wording that's repeated at high frequencies? Are there co-occurrences of specific topics, words? Again, what's not measured? Inferences of out-group and in-group distinctions. And again, also a potential that people might have complexity in their attitudes, and how can survey items either miss that complexity, overlook that complexity, or try and capture it. Again, I'll just give you a bit of a taste of what this looks like, but I wanted to give you a sense of examples, right? So for example, when mother and child appear in abortion attitude research, things like Medicare already has too many children. These are going to be some of the examples you'll see when I give what the specific items start to look like. So just to pause in an actual measure, this is from the General Social Survey, otherwise known as GSS, which is a very common It's a very large national data set. A lot of researchers turn to this data set when studying a wide array of social issues, experiences, and identities across the US. So some of you may have encountered or worked with the General Social Survey, but here's what that survey includes in terms of assessing abortion attitudes. There are 7 questions. Please tell me whether or not you think it should be possible for a pregnant woman to obtain a legal abortion. And then there's a series of statements. So if. So I just want to highlight a few. There's a few decisions that the researchers made in writing these items. And here we can just start to bring this kind of sensibility to the forefront. If there is a strong chance of a serious defect in the baby, right? So we see a word choice here, baby rather than fetus. So a kind of particular word choice we might pay attention to. And the 4th, if the family has a low income and cannot afford any more children. So on its face value, we might start to say, well, sure, that might be a way we want to think about it. But I want to argue just at this smaller level, right? A certain kind of association that participants are being asked to make here between pregnancy, abortion, and poverty. And then following up, if she is married and does not want to marry the man. I would argue, again, we're starting to see important associations made here in this measure of this woman making some decisions. Not that we understand anything about her, but we do have associations, as informed much by the Moynihan report, of a woman not wanting to marry the man. So I just want, for those that have encountered the Moynihan report, but for those that might not have, the association of Black women not wanting to marry male partners is a really key argument in the Moynihan report and a deep, historically informed negative stereotype about Black women that I would argue this GSS is tapping. And this is my theoretical work, which I'm going to turn to the more empirical work, but I wanted to walk you through how then this kind of assessment of a measure, you might have a couple of hats on, right? What are the word choices? What is the role of historical imagery here? What kinds of associations are we making to this woman who is making choices? What's her life and how are we being asked to evaluate it? So last is this word wants. If the woman wants it for any reason, I would argue that's an incredibly loaded word. What if that read, if the woman needs it for any reason, right? So even if you swap out words, you start to see that there's some choices being made when we take this kind of critical evaluation to an assessment of something like abortion attitudes. So with that in mind, I want to walk through just a few thematic findings from when I've analyzed this with these theoretical and historically informed questions in mind. So there's a couple of themes that I want to draw our attention to. One is the evaluations of women's reproductive decision-making. And we found very much a set of moral evaluations of both women in general, women seeking abortion care, and abortion itself. There's also a set of sexual evaluations of women's sexual behavior, their relationship status, and previous unintended pregnancies. So you can see that's why I walked through the GSS, because you can start to see that, and that's just one. So those are 7 of the items of the 456 in the item bank. And then financial evaluations, references to government oversight, financial responsibility for abortion costs, and healthcare more generally. So this is a way for us to start to think. So you can see we've moved from a kind of item bank, a systematic evaluation, to a thematic analysis, meaning looking for themes and how these themes help us see patterns in the item bank. So again, as the reference for this is where this data has been published. And you can see I've drawn from the title and the fabric of research. So let me just give you a taste of what these 3 themes look like. So a moral evaluation is often a way that people are asked to think if something is good or bad, right or wrong. So we might then think abortion is acceptable if the woman cannot take care of her child. So we, as a participant, if we were to answer this actual item question, which is in circulated in research, asks a couple of things of us, right? It asks us to think about if something is okay or acceptable or allowed, which you might argue is one of the functions of a survey asking about abortion research. But we also then want to think about what's the relationship that we are being asked to take and to whom. Items ask respondents to evaluate an imagined woman and weigh factors to make moral evaluations. And as you saw in the GSS, I argue within a series of unfortunate events. And so that kind of signaling of defect, as they say, in the baby, or there's a serious health risk to the woman if she can't afford more children, right? So there's this sort of series of what I'm putting in quotes, unfortunate events. But even in the moral evaluation moment, we want to think about how we're being positioned as participants to think about abortion, but also this woman. And why is she in this series of unfortunate events? So I'm just trying to give a kind of flavor of how you might evaluate survey assessments like this. But an important piece of this is that there's a shift. If this is an assessment of abortion attitudes, there's a shift we can start to trace towards an evaluation of the woman and less about abortion, right? You can see from those examples I gave a few minutes ago, we are being asked to evaluate, and this is thematically across the whole item bank of 456 unique items, how participants are being positioned. And in this case, I would argue to evaluate this hypothetical woman, her career, her education, her marital status, being too poor. So this is a kind of way that we want to see slippage, and we want to be very attentive to that slippage. In terms of measurement, I would also argue there's an inaccurate measurement then happening here. There's a real conflation of the woman, her economic, social, and relational conditions, and the abortion itself. So what we then don't know as a researcher is what's actually being evaluated here. And I would argue there's a very muddy evaluation happening. So let's turn to the sexual evaluations theme. She already has too many children as one example item. She is not married and does not want to marry the man. So you can recognize that one from the GSS. So this is where attention to language and word choices by researchers is incredibly helpful. Things like slept with, unwed, single, unmarried, does not want to marry the man, signal some decisions that researchers have made about what sexuality looks like. It assumes the centrality of marriage as the correct site of pregnancy and abortion decisions. And again, it's uncertain at a measurement level, right? If we're wanting to think about accurately assessing people's attitudes, is the respondent reporting on their attitudes about women in general, women's sexuality, sex outside of marriage, or a woman making irresponsible decisions, say, about marital status, having too many children? You start to see there's an irresponsible sexual actor being kind of thematically portrayed through these items. Similarly, there's a financially irresponsible actor being constructed through these items. And here we can see an example of an item: the government should not cover the medical costs of abortions for poor women who cannot afford the procedure. So we start to see some layering here and a real theme throughout the item bank. What's the role of government? What's the role of public resources, public supports offered? What's the role of poverty? And what's the role of abortion and poverty here? So similar, I think, attention to word choice, women who cannot afford, a real eliciting of a very particular kind of set of associations between government support and abortion. Items that link economic and familial failures while assessing a person's attitude towards abortion. So again, a kind of under the surface construction of an irresponsible woman. Again, it conflates attitudes towards poor women, attitudes about government spending, and attitudes about abortion care. So I would argue, for all these reasons, a kind of muddiness in our research on this particular topic. Similar, if we wanted to think about item gaps, right? This was one of the things, and just to give you one example, no items that might look at, say, structural circumstances, having a low wage job, not having completed high school, not having had access to high quality education. These things are not evaluated. We meet this woman making this decision without any attention to those structural circumstances that might have gotten her there. So as a respondent, we are asked to sort of have an amnesia about contexts, and our data then also have that amnesia. I want to give one last example of passive voice, and this is one other thing to be really attentive to. So here's one example of, but this is a repeated theme throughout the item bank. Do you favor, oppose, or neither favor or oppose abortion being legal if the pregnancy was caused by the woman being raped? I think this is an excellent example of the way that a kind of passive voice moves into designs and does some really important to track education of how then participants are thinking about rape and in thinking about abortion as a result, right? So passive voice frames the woman in this case as having made herself pregnant. There is no other actor mentioned and participating in her. So a woman having made herself pregnant and participating in her own rape, because there's an absence of others in this item. So I just wanted to offer as a kind of alternative way of thinking about this, how you might write items that undo some of these things, because I also wanted to offer some ideas about how you can combat some of this. So including the assailant in the item would change it from passive to active voice. And here's two examples. The woman was raped by a man and became pregnant as a result. So you could still use the first part of the question, but just shifting some of that language, or a man raped a woman and caused her pregnancy. So here's just ways that you might be attentive to both how items are worded and the assumptions and constructions of responsibility that are happening. So I want to argue that this is what I think is crucial in thinking about dispersion of bias. So this is, I think, the way that I want to think about the stakes of these questions. So if we just start with the survey item, right, that's what we've been thinking about. And just to give you a sense of circulation, so NORC is a research institute in Chicago, and they administer the General Social Survey, just so you have a sense. More than 22,000 journal articles, books, and PhD dissertations are based on the GSS. And about 400,000 students use the GSS in their classes each year. So that doesn't necessarily mean the abortion measure in particular, but just thinking about the sheer exposure. This doesn't even take into account the number of participants taking the study, right? So we start with what might look benign, mundane as a survey item, and then we want to think, how does that inform media coverage or legislative environments or attitudes about women? So this kind of what looks small, I really want to argue that that moves out into the cultural discourse, political environments, support for laws or not support for laws in really important ways. So that dispersion of bias is why I think the stakes of this are so high. Again, just to sort of return to our deservingness question, I think we want to think through how deservingness is constructed continuously through survey items, and how then as participants, as researchers, as consumers of research, we are taught to think of some as deserving and some as not. So with an eye on time, I just want to touch on one last thing and then I'm going to close. And this has to do with data collected from participants about some of these issues. So here's just a brief description of the study. It's a study with 72 people that I interviewed in person in 2019. And they were in 3 states, Arizona, Kansas, and Michigan. And they both had rural, we had rural locations identified and urban locations identified in the 3 states. Political ideology was varied across the sample. Age, you can see the race, ethnicity aspects of the sample. Participants were paid $100 and I talked to them for about 90 minutes. So with that in mind, I just want to touch on one piece, but I'm also happy to talk more about this study. And I just want to give you a sense of the kind of array of methods that I used in the study. They answered a survey. They did a cognitive debrief, which I'm going to define in a second and just show you a little bit of data on. I also used illustrations to try and understand the kind of person that was imagined as relevant in an abortion attitude. And I used those as a way of thinking about, particularly about skin tone and age and the kind of imagined woman in people's minds, and then an interview. I'm happy again to go into any more detail during the Q&A or discussion about all of this. But I just want to touch on one example of a question I asked in the cognitive debrief portion of the study. A cognitive debrief is where you might ask a survey question, the person answers the question, and then you say, can you tell me more about how or what you thought about when you were answering that question? That allows people to elaborate their answers. So you can see this is a pretty common theme in my research, right? asking the question and then kind of asking someone to unpack their answer a little bit. So the question that of many different questions I ask participants, do you agree there should be consequences for getting an abortion? A lot, a little, not at all. What kinds of consequences were you thinking of? And then I prompted if they didn't bring any up, legal, financial, moral, other kinds of consequences. So this was just a portion of the meeting, but I wanted to give you just a taste of what some of these look like, right? What are the characteristics, and do people imagine consequences? I put this in the context of current legislative decisions, and in Texas, Senate Bill 8 is a really important context. And for those that aren't aware of the Senate bill that has passed and last year allows citizens to sue anyone they believe were involved in helping someone obtain abortion after 6 weeks. So that is now law in Texas. Sotomayor, in her dissent, argues that the Texas legislature has deputized state citizens as bounty hunters, offering them cash prizes for civilly prosecuting their neighbors' medical procedures. So this is an important context, and partly I knew some of this legislation was in the pipeline, which is partly why the study asked this. And just to give you a context, since this I feel like is an important thing too, is some of the counter discourses around this, or I should say inline discourses, but counter to thinking about reproductive rights. Right, so the sort of naming of women as whores if they don't know that they're pregnant before 6 weeks. But of course, most women and people who get pregnant don't know that they're pregnant until after 6 weeks. But I wanted to give you just a taste of the public discourses surrounding these in case this is something that you're not able to track. And believe me, we are not able to track all the things happening around us right now. So hence I wanted to give a little bit of background. But just to give you a sense of what people said, a taste of kind of the kinds of ways that people are thinking about this. Again, if you ask people, then you start to see how the kind of imagined role of themselves and of people who get pregnant, the kind of ways that we might think of punishing folks. So this is a longer quote, but I can just go to the bolded part, right? A lot of things come to mind. There should be fines, but also punishment, jail, because it is a murder. So not unexpected, lots of people, about half the US, imagine a pro-life and identify as pro-life. Some then also think about abortion as murder. But we also then want to think about other kinds of images that came to the forefront. Maybe they should be forced onto birth control if you are unable to pay for the abortion yourself. So just to highlight, you see some callbacks, right, to the survey items that I was mentioning a minute ago. We're going to put you on birth control. We're going to get you sterilized. Again, what I would argue here is we see a historical discourse around enforced sterilization, which has been absolutely targeted to Black women and women of color in the US. So the fact that we hear this and see this in participants' answers should force us, encourage us to, as researchers, really think about the historical construction of these attitudes. We see other things like take away food stamps. So again, a kind of affirmation of how poverty and abortion have been linked. And I just wanted to also note that some really imagine religious consequences. So here's just that taste of how we can think about that, just to summarize of what I just said, and then I'm going to close: legal consequences, gender consequences, and religious consequences. Again, I'm happy to talk more in depth about these, but I wanted to tie this to ongoing political legislation about what's happening in the US so that you can see how this is playing out, both in terms of research and policymaking. And I think quite clear, the discussion of deservingness there seems quite clear about who is imagined as deserving care, who is imagined as being punished for medical procedures, and who's imagined as not deserving of our kind of attention and careful care of in our imagination. So to wrap up, I wanted to return to this, right, critical research methods. That's sort of what we've traveled through together. And we went through the self-anchored ladder, thinking about how people think about satisfaction. We went through the item bank, thinking about how researchers have constructed some and relied on really shared imagery and wording choices. And then lastly, this cognitive debriefing to ask people to unpack some of their ideas as a way of thinking both how they might think about it, answer a question, and how they rely on a certain kind of set of ideas, images, expectations, and associations. So with that, I really want to thank you for your time. Of course, if there's Q&A, we'll turn to that now, but also any of the publications that I mentioned are all linked and their PDFs are on the website progresslab.info.
Wow, Dr. Sara McClelland, that was outstanding. Thank you for your presentation. So yes, now we will open it up to questions. Please enter your questions into the Q&A. And we already have questions, so I'll jump right in. Could you discuss briefly how you analyzed and interpreted the responses to the questions on sexual satisfaction that you shared with us?
Yes, it's a great question. So I offer 4 strategies for analyzing those data, because I think that's an excellent question, because it does raise, there's not a path forward that would be immediately visible. What do you do with all those data? So there's 4, and in the publication, I describe these in more detail. You could just look at the quantitative, and you could even look at the answers they put on the ladder and treat that like a quantitative assessment. You could then even look at those quantitative assessments by particular demographics, their gender identity, their sexual identity, their racial or ethnic identity. So you could even then group by that. And that's what I might call a sort of traditional quantitative assessment analysis. You're going to look by group. You're going to maybe look at those scores. You could compare the scores by groups. You then, a second strategy, you could look at how, if there's high or low, right, that you might then divide that by the score and then think about who's low on that score, who's high on that score. So then looking at what we might, sometimes that's called a kind of clustering of groups. And then you might look at both the quantitative and qualitative for who's in the low. That might be the people. That also might be, so what are the themes I see in the low group versus the high group? A third strategy is to think about what I was calling dimensions or factors, right? What are the things that are appearing in people's assessments of low and high? And that's a little bit what I was trying to do verbally. And then the fourth, which I think is interesting and something that is a little harder to do, but I think really useful, is to look at the organization of the ladder and what are people relying on that helps them move from low to high. So in my study, I found that people rely on frequency of what we might call a kind of positive physical outcome, maybe like orgasm rate, so low to high orgasm. So that's kind of physical. There's also kind of an emotional organization of the ladder. You saw that with like feeling uncomfortable or loved, right? That's a kind of emotional strata. There's also other kinds of relational pieces, presence of or absence of a partner to a presence of a partner. So the kind of ways that people are categorizing increases, right? How people bring a set of expectations to, like, I think low to high moves in this way, offers another way. So those are 4. I think there's lots of others. And in the publication, I walk through what you would do for each of those. But I very much see this as an invitation to think with other people about how they might approach that ladder.
Okay, thank you. Sara, another question sort of building on that question is what would be a good sample size for the open-ended ladder method?
Ooh, great question. I don't think there's a limit, or I don't think a small or a big limit. I've done it now with 32, and I've done it with over 1,000 online. So I think there's not a minimum. I actually think you could do it with enough that you could find range if you wanted to look across a group, but I also think you could do it with a singular individual. I think an N of 1 here would be perfectly fine as a way of understanding something. So people, I know when I've talked to clinicians, people in therapy, it's actually a tool that people have taken into therapeutic spaces. So in that case, it would be a kind of one person. For those thinking about groups, I don't think that there's a minimum. You're not looking to make a generalizable thing, which is why we might worry about sample size. You're looking to make interesting or useful comparisons or patterns or assessments of how the quantitative might be missing the qualitative, or the insights that the qualitative brings. So it might be that you want to think even at a small scale, because that might bring a lot of information. So I don't think there's any rules, again, about sample size. Sample size only comes into play when you're really trying to say like all of humans or all of Americans or all of some other group. So I think feel free, one is great.
Thank you.
Did you find questions in the abortion attitudes item bank that you thought were model questions?
Great question. I think there are some really lovely, more recently developed items that bring in just a very slight shift in wording, which, for example, moves from a prior version to a new version of the same kind of question. A prior version read something like, I'm going to get the exact wording wrong, but you get the idea. Do you support legal abortion? Yes, no, maybe. So here I'm going to concentrate on the response options. That's what those are called. Same question, but yes, no, conflicted. So there, it's a small wording shift. We, again, without more qualitative data, don't know exactly what conflicted means, but I think it allows a participant to actually imagine that their opinion may be more complicated than yes, no, maybe, because maybe doesn't tell us very much. I think conflicted. So again, one word distinction here offers a different kind of way for a participant to engage with the material. So it's really small things like that that I think offer, as researchers, an ability to see more complexity rather than a binary, and allow participants to engage perhaps with more level of, one might call it authenticity, one might call it accuracy, or even just that more of them is able to show up. So I think that that's just one example, but there's some others that I think do some nice allowing for more, a way for people to bring a bit more of themselves to the question.
Thank you.
Our next question is, was it common that people you interviewed about abortion attitudes went straight to, quote, women who seek abortion are poor, end quote?
Was the question that, is that a common theme?
Yeah, so was it common that the people you interviewed about abortion attitudes went straight to that particular?
It was an incredibly common theme in the interview portion of the study. For example, I can give just one way that appeared, because when people talk about poverty in the US, we have so little language for thinking about social class, poverty. So as a researcher, I might offer that there's other things you need to listen to how people describe this. So one of the things that I did in the studies, I asked, can you tell me in your, it doesn't have to be correct, can you tell me where you think more abortions occur in the US? Is there a place? And again, I do a lot then in the interview to say this doesn't need to be correct, because it doesn't, but I wanted to get the kind of associations that people have. And the two cities that are named the most are Detroit and Chicago, which are majority Black cities. So there's some way that there's an associative process, and then asking why, that's often then where people would think. And so again, I was in Arizona, Kansas, and Michigan. So those two cities are appearing in people's imaginations more than others. We might also argue that they might have high population. So maybe people are thinking that. So I don't know the exact interpretive links here, but I can then say in follow-up questions, and you can even see in some of the ways that people spoke, poor women were the most commonly imagined. So this was a place that people often thought about it, poor women differently described, differently raced, but very much as a kind of key and automatic association, I would argue.
Yeah, thank you.
Did the folks you interviewed about the abortion questions have any metacognitive reflections as part of their answers? Something like an aha moment about how the questions encouraged them in a particular direction?
Oh, what a lovely question. I'm trying to think of a good example. The answer is yes, but the answer also was not always. So I don't want to, but sometimes I should say that probably what I heard the most is people asking for me as a researcher to either change their mind or argue with me, which is fine. This happens in research all the time. I don't see this as particular to abortion. But I definitely saw folks think through, I'm trying to think if there's a good example of where I saw this, but the way of then hearing themselves talk. So often in that cognitive debrief portion of the study where people would answer a question and then hear themselves, there were times in that, I would say across the sample where people said things like, oh, I see how I think about that. So I wouldn't say it was always an aha moment, but a metacognitive moment of hearing themselves think about something that almost everyone said they don't talk about with other people. So what's I think unique to abortion is that people keep their attitudes often just within themselves. Some were very involved in church efforts or advocacy efforts and did clinic, protesting. So there was a wide range of people that had access to talk about abortion with other folks. But when I asked, for folks, some folks did protested outside of abortion clinics. I said, do you talk about your attitudes or opinions with those that you might be protesting with? Everyone said no. So even with folks that might have had that opportunity, while that was potentially a place to do it, almost, because I did ask, is this something you talk about with people? Nearly everyone said no. So it often was the first time that people heard themselves say some of the stuff out loud. So I'd say the metacognition was on that, but I didn't hear people do aha moments to change anything. It was more listening to how they had come to some of their ideas, which was the aha moment. Not a aha, I think differently, but more aha, oh, that's how I think. I didn't know.
Another question for you that we're interested in is what kind of response do you get when you are critical of a known tool like the General Social Survey? Any pushback, any support?
Yes, great question. These are really lovely. Here's the thing. I'm a lone, I have a team, I'm part of a larger project, but GSS researchers are very well established in the field. I'm not sure that I am doing, my critique is what we might call a small scale. So I have not gotten pushback. I think if anything, GSS, I've certainly spoken with those who are involved with GSS item writing. They are very interested in that same measure because it's been used since the mid or early 70s. So the GSS has been using that same assessment, I believe, since 1972, which allows really powerful ways of looking for change over time. In general, US attitude opinions have not changed that much. It's usually a 50-50-ish split. I would argue and have argued that I think that's because that assessment is missing some important pieces. So the fact that we've held so stable while so much in the US has changed around abortion care and policies and legislations and cultural discourses, I would argue we should see some of that showing up in the public opinion data that the GSS offers us. I have not gotten pushback, I think largely because there's a real commitment to that as a longitudinal assessment, meaning same questions asked over a long period of time. So I understand why that's a really important structure. However, if we're going to use it to make legislation or to think about where the country is or to think about the range of ways that people think about it, I think that assessment is not offering us that. It's offering us a picture that we've taken sequentially for now since 1972. So no, I have not gotten that pushback, but I think largely I'm in no danger of undoing that.
Thank you. I would just speak the difficulty of sort of replication and benchmarking, and how to change that. The inherent value of those things, but while also recognizing the problems of those things at the same time. Yeah.
Did you use participant marginalia in your interviews or surveys?
That's such a lovely question. Thanks for the call back to my other work. So marginalia, just to define it, is where I have, in a very old-fashioned way, which I really want to recognize, but I'm happy to talk about it in online, but in paper and pencil surveys, I have made a practice now for 15 years of using, when I use paper and pencil, analyzing what people write in the comments, in the margins, the notes they make, the things they underline, the things they cross out, the things they write set to say, not applicable to me, or you missed something because here's what my life looks like. So for researchers of all types who might use survey, consistently people have ignored the marginalia. It's very hard to assess. So when I saw this coming back in my own research, and this actually started with a study I wrote about it with women that had metastatic breast cancer, and I had given them a paper and pencil survey, and they wrote such important things in the margins that I said, I need to make a kind of typology, a practice, a method to offer other researchers so that they could do something with this really important data. And so that's where I've really tried to elaborate how researchers might use that, because I see, much like in my answer to the other question, I see why people discard it. It's hard, but it means we've missed the mark as researchers, and participants are trying to help us hear them. So if we throw it away, we've missed the opportunity to think with them, to learn from them. And isn't that what research is supposed to be doing? So in the abortion study, there is great marginalia. And what I did there was, especially with the illustration. So what I did is I had on a table 12 like drawn illustrations of women with different skin tones, different economic kind of indicators behind them, nice homes, more kind of chaos in the picture for some, kind of thinking about a kind of different kind of environment, different numbers of kids. So just trying to understand how people are kind of imagining. And then so that they didn't say the illustration out loud to me, but I asked, is there a picture here that comes closest to who you might have imagined when answering this question? And then there's great marginalia of where people both wrote, I don't want to look racist. So a lot of kind of what we call social desirability, which is people being very afraid to say racist things out loud to another person, which is why I had them writing it down to try and decrease some of the concerns about that image management. But they also then wrote, I think, really helpful things as I'm trying to develop this as a method. So I'm now testing some illustrations to try and see about how we can make this even a more robust way of getting at imagination, which is a really hard thing to get at. But there's some great marginalia that I've used to think about. For example, someone wrote, I don't think about kids, but I think about their ability to, when I answered this question, so think of like the GSS question, I thought of them as much more pregnant, much more visibly pregnant. So I had kind of women that didn't appear pregnant and women who appeared more visibly pregnant. So really thinking about how when people imagine abortion, they often imagine people in a second and third trimester pregnancy. So this kind of visibly pregnant person is a really common association people have. Now, of course, most abortions happen in the first trimester where there is no visible bump. But what the marginalia really underscored was that people's imaginations have that because the media has often used that image. So that is a good example of where marginalia have been really important. And I continue to use it in paper and pencil surveys and online surveys, which I'm also happy to talk with folks about.
Thank you. I think we had another question in the Q&A, but I think you answered it just now. So, but if you don't mind, well, actually, I have a question for you related to the self-anchored model, ladder model that you shared. And just curious, how have research participants responded to it? Has there been any resistance to that kind of level of freedom, or anything you've heard from them?
Well, this is a really important way of thinking about doing research, I would offer, because I started using it and I stayed in the room with people so they could give me feedback about it. When I very first developed it back in the kind of late, early 2000s. And I stayed in the room because I wasn't sure if people would be able to interact with it clearly enough. And I would say that people can follow it. I didn't have miscommunication. But being in person, people do fill it out more, because I have also used this online. And as in all online research, people skip things more. So I do think it asks a lot of a participant, but I've now done it where it was in person and I was in the room, in person and I was not in the room, and online. So thinking about those dimensions, those kind of contexts. And I would say that the way that people push back, because they do on every kind of research item or survey item, is they say, I don't know how to think about this. And that's fair enough. Not everybody has that capacity. I think it has it's both taxing in a survey. People didn't expect to have to think that hard, but also sometimes people answer one thing across, so they don't know how to categorize. Also, fair enough, that categorization is a really complicated thing to ask people to do. So they'll write one kind of either sentence or paragraph that stretches across the 3 points. They'll still answer the quantitative. That feels, I think, more straightforward. But the qualitative, they'll sort of have a free association there, which gives me lots of information, but isn't kind of set up in those categories. I would say across me doing this now for 15 years, I feel like it is legible across lots of different groups. I think it is taxing, but I do think that any kind of qualitative aspect in a survey or outside of a survey is taxing. And I think it's important to recognize that. But I think it has been largely understood. And I haven't gotten pushback except in skipping, which is a form of pushback, I would argue.
Any positive?
Yes, people love having the chance to explain themselves. I think the feeling that people have especially when answering big, hard things, is I wish I could say more. Or I mean it in these conditions and not those conditions, or these things and not those things. So I have to say that both direct comment from participants when I'm with them, or online when I often ask, what was this like? Do you have feedback? Was this hard? Did it feel relevant to you? I often try and get a little debriefing in there. Often is like, oh, I felt like I could finally say this with more detail. So a real hunger is what I would say I feel and hear from participants about their wish to say more, and that often research turns away from them rather than leaning in closer. So I think the ladder has been imagined as like, I'd like to explain myself. I'd like to say more. You've asked me a really hard question, but you only asked me to fill in one dot. That doesn't represent me. So yes, comparing the pushback to the not pushback, I would say a lot of enthusiasm.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, sorry to do this to you, but we're winding down our time together, so we need to end this conversation for today. Thank you to Sara, Letha, and Sophie. Can we get some applause for them in the chat? We'd like to thank Loyola Marymount University for its support of the Institute for Research Design and Librarianship, and to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for your consistent grant support of IRDL since 2014. We invite you to join us for our final event in this year's speaker series. It's going to be a discussion about how to apply to our research what we've learned from this season's speakers. That discussion is happening on February 21st at 11 a.m. Pacific. I'll drop the registration URL in the chat and invite you to come think with us. So with that, final thanks to Sara, Sophie, and Letha, and hope you all have a great rest of your day. See you next time.